Real versus personal property. In the previous section, you learned that ownership of real estate includes a variety of rights, such as air, surface, subsurface, and water rights, and that these can be separated, transferred, or limited. Building on that foundation, we now explore another essential distinction in real estate: the difference between real property and personal property. Understanding this distinction is critical in every real estate transaction because it determines what is legally conveyed when ownership changes hands. Real property, also called realty, includes the land itself, anything permanently attached to it, and the legal rights associated with its ownership. Personal property, by contrast, includes movable items not intended to remain with the land. Personal property, also called chattel, includes tangible things such as furniture, vehicles, or jewelry, and intangible items like patents, leases, and contracts. The distinction between the two becomes important when a property is sold. Unless otherwise specified, real property transfers with the sale, while personal property remains with the seller. For example, if a seller removes their washer and dryer before closing, that is permissible because they are personal property. However, removing built-in cabinetry or a chandelier permanently affixed to the ceiling would not be, since those are considered part of the real property. Fixtures and the tests of annexation, adaptation, and intention. Sometimes personal property becomes part of the real property through the process of annexation, when an item is physically attached or adapted to the land or structure. Once attached, it becomes a fixture. A fixture is personal property that has been permanently affixed to real estate so that it becomes part of it. Examples include ceiling fans, built-in appliances, light fixtures, and fences. Courts typically use three main criteria to determine whether something is a fixture or remains personal property: annexation, adaptation, and intention. Annexation refers to the act of attachment. If the removal of an item would damage the property, or if it has been firmly affixed, such as a door or a central heating system, it is likely a fixture. In some cases, even items not physically fastened but essential to the property's function, like a 4-ton statue secured by its own weight, have been deemed fixtures. Adaptation refers to whether the item has been specifically designed or customized for use with the property. For example, storm windows cut to fit a specific frame, custom kitchen cabinets, or a built-in aquarium are adapted to the property and therefore treated as fixtures. Intention is the most significant test and focuses on what the installer intended when affixing the item. If a homeowner installs a built-in oven to make the property more functional, the court will infer that the intention was for it to remain with the home. Conversely, if a tenant installs equipment with the intention of removing it at the end of the lease, it remains personal property. Trade fixtures and tenant rights. Trade fixtures, also known as chattel fixtures, are personal property items that a commercial tenant attaches to leased property to conduct business. Examples include ovens in a bakery, display shelves in a boutique, or dental equipment in a clinic. These fixtures are unique because they remain the personal property of the tenant and can be removed before or upon lease termination, provided that removal does not cause substantial damage to the premises. If a tenant fails to remove a trade fixture before vacating, ownership transfers to the landlord through a process known as accession, and the fixture becomes part of the real property. To avoid disputes, commercial leases often include detailed provisions specifying what constitutes a trade fixture and who retains ownership upon lease expiration. Emblements. The crop exception. Emblements are another special category of personal property. They refer to growing crops that require human labor and cultivation, such as wheat, corn, or vegetables. Although they are physically attached to the land, they are treated as personal property because they result from the tenant farmer's efforts. Even if the lease ends before harvest, the tenant retains ownership of the crops and the right to re-enter the land to harvest them. In contrast, natural vegetation, trees, grasses, and shrubs that grow without human effort, are part of the real property and belong to the landowner. Conversion. Between real and personal property. The classification of property is not always permanent. Through the process of conversion, real property can become personal property and vice versa. Severance is when real property becomes personal property by detaching it from the land. For example, cutting down a tree or removing built-in shelves. Affixing or annexation is the opposite process, where personal property becomes real property by being attached to the land, such as installing a fence or a water heater. Tangible and intangible property. Both real and personal property can be further classified as tangible or intangible. Tangible property has physical substance and can be touched, such as furniture, cars, or machinery. Intangible property, on the other hand, represents ownership rights that cannot be physically touched, like a lease agreement, patent, or stock certificate. For instance, a farmer's tractor is tangible personal property, while the lease allowing the farmer to use another's land is intangible property. Review summary. In this section, you learned that property is divided into real and personal categories. Real property includes land, improvements, and the associated legal rights, while personal property includes movable items. Fixtures bridge the gap between these two categories, as they begin as personal property but become real property once attached to the land. Trade fixtures remain personal property used for business and must be removed before a lease expires. Implements are crops treated as personal property even though they grow on land. Finally, conversion can change property classification depending on whether it is affixed or detached, and property can be tangible or intangible depending on its physical nature. Discussion. Why are fixtures significant in real estate transactions? Answer. Because they determine what transfers with the sale. Fixtures are considered part of the real property, while personal property is not, which affects what the buyer receives and the seller retains. What distinguishes a trade fixture from a regular fixture? Answer. A trade fixture is installed by a tenant for business purposes and remains personal property, while a regular fixture becomes part of the real estate. Why are implements treated as personal property? Answer. Because they are the result of the tenant's labor and investment rather than natural growth, giving the tenant the right to harvest them even after the lease ends. How can real property become personal property? Answer. Through severance, when an item is detached from the land, such as removing a door or harvesting timber. Closing remarks. Distinguishing between real and personal property lies at the heart of every real estate transaction. Knowing which items stay and which go ensures fairness and clarity between buyers and sellers. It also protects tenants and landlords in commercial and agricultural arrangements. As you advance in your real estate studies, remember that every physical object on a property, from light fixtures to crops, carries a legal classification that determines its ownership and transfer rights. A true professional recognizes these distinctions and ensures they are clearly stated in every contract and lease.